Okay, so we're going to tie in a couple of concepts here when we're talking about ventilation and metabolism. Okay, and this really starts to explain a little bit of some of the physiology stuff that we've covered previously in this chapter to do with our respiratory system and ventilation rates, but also what that means while we're exercising. And metabolism is a good way to tie into this discussion. Okay. So, our first concept that we need to cover is going to be called ventilatory equivalence. And this is the amount of air ventilated that you need to, either in one condition, obtain a liter of oxygen for use, obviously, in metabolism, or to breathe out 1 liter of carbon dioxide. So that indicates the other end of our metabolism, right? So, we take in oxygen, put it through our metabolic processes, and on the end, we get carbon dioxide. Okay. So we typically express it, so ventilatory equivalent of oxygen to be specific, and that's VE over VO2, or the pulmonary ventilation, how much you're breathing in and out, over the amount of volume of oxygen, okay, that you obtain from that. Very similar concept with carbon dioxide, but that's exhaling. And we use this to find something, or these two concepts. We use these two concepts to find our ventilatory threshold. Now, what is the ventilatory threshold? Happy you asked. It's the workload at which there is an increase in the ventilatory equivalent of oxygen and no change in the ventilatory equivalence of carbon dioxide. And so we can use this to estimate our lactate threshold. Okay. Now, our lactate threshold is when we kind of start using our anaerobic system as like a turbo overdrive sort of button. Okay. So what we're able to do is aerobic activity all the way up to the point of ventilatory threshold, or our anaerobic or lactate threshold. Okay, that's interchanged terminology there. Okay. Yeah, and one of the reasons for all of this is, again, our anaerobic metabolism, so glycolysis in particular, produces a lot of protons, so it makes a lot of acidic conditions, example, lactic acid, and that stimulates our peripheral chemoreceptors in our blood, which increase our ventilation and in order to expel carbon dioxide, right? Remember, carbon dioxide builds up once we start relying on anaerobic metabolism. So therefore, our ventilatory threshold, or VT, indicates the point where our body, again, switches from aerobic and starts utilizing anaerobic respiration to quickly make a lot of ATP for us, because our aerobic system is falling behind based off of our workload. Okay, so let's see what that looks like, all of this, and the previous slide on a graph. And this again helps explain some of the previous things that we've discussed about our respiratory system. So for example, we'll just start off with looking at our O2, or oxygen ventilatory equivalent, here in the blue line, and workload here in watts. I believe the best way to think of this is on a bike. So you're cycling and you produce a certain force on the pedals over time, and for each kind of given second or 3-second interval, you get an average of how many watts or power you put out. And that's a really good objective measure of your workload. Okay, so all it's saying is here is zero workload, here's maximal workload, okay, on the x-axis. Sorry, I had to pause there. Where was I? So we're going to explain this a little bit. So what we're seeing here with this ventilatory equivalent of VO2 is we start to see this drop, okay? And what this is more or less saying is we hit this certain amount of workload where, aerobically speaking, we actually become more efficient than when we're at rest. And what that means is, for the amount of air that we're breathing in, we're actually utilizing and gaining or getting a greater amount of oxygen into our bodies. Once we start exercising more intensely, so we get to a certain tipping point here, our ventilatory threshold, what we see is an increase, and then a secondary increase at our RCP, which is the respiratory compensation point. And again, we just see a larger incline or spike up there. So what's happening once we start seeing higher and higher numbers as far as our ventilatory equivalent for oxygen? Well, what we're saying is our ventilatory rate is exceeding and getting larger than the actual volume of oxygen we're getting. And what that is an indication of inefficient breathing. So the fact that our respiratory rate gets to a point where we're outpacing or outbreathing the capacity for us to actually take in and use the liter of oxygen we have, or that's present there, again, is just inefficient breathing. So, and that happens, again, the first tipping point is for our ventilatory threshold. So, that kind of when the anaerobic system kicks in and starts making that excessive CO2, a greater amount of hydrogen protons, so it becomes more acidic. So that cues up faster ventilation relative to the used oxygen. Okay. And again, when we hit the secondary point, that's kind of like our terminal checkoff point for our RCP. In particular, we want to note that it's the work intensity when both ventilatory equivalents for our VO2 and our VCO2 increase, and that's really when we've pushed into our anaerobic threshold, and we start getting into our essentially very high intensity exercise that isn't very sustainable. Okay, and we can make 3 training zones from this knowledge as well. So our ventilatory threshold, anything below that, so anything in this area, we would consider very light exercise. Between here and here, we consider moderate exercise, and then this would be high intensity exercise, not sustainable. I would say largely anaerobic systems working, whereas here we still get a little bit of a combination of the two. Okay, and so now we're moving forward from that point. We're going to see what's the upper limits of our ventilation, and ultimately what we're looking at that point in time is some things happen, and they're primarily to do in and around the diaphragm. So we get to this point where we have such a high frequency of respiratory rate that our diaphragm, even though it's oxidative in nature and aerobic in nature, so it's fatigue resistance, it can still get fatigued. And we usually see this around 80 to 80% of our VO2 peak to exhaustion. And essentially what needs to happen at that point in time is all our accessory ventilatory muscles, like the intercostals or abdominals, our neck muscles, right? They all come into play to kind of help meet the respiratory demands that the diaphragm alone isn't necessarily meeting, and typically that can occur. So again, when we're talking about training respiratory muscles, one of the things that does happen with endurance training, or sometimes when people have a condition called COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is we see that the respiratory muscles become more fatigue resistant. So they do become trained, which is the primary assisting factor when we're considering the respiratory system and any adaptations or training effects that might occur. Okay. With strength training, so that was endurance training. With strength training, the diaphragm can increase in some size, so it becomes a little it can undergo hypertrophy. Uh, but that's again a little bit more in relation to strength training versus cardiovascular work. Okay, and that concludes your respiratory system.